Imagine that you run a large and profitable company that's been around for decades. You have millions of customers, having become a household name for your product or service that you provide. But then one day, people start realizing that your products or services have been causing some egregious societal harm over the course of decades, such as a consumer product that causes cancer, or perhaps electrical transmission lines that have been starting wildfires in drought-stricken regions. And the courts side against you, ordering you to pay hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars worth of damages and penalties to the victims. You can't win all of these lawsuits, and the magnitude of the liabilities could take you out for good. You could declare bankruptcy, which, while it would wipe out shareholders, could allow the business's operations and brand to survive. But what if you could benefit from all of those protections offered by bankruptcy law without all the downsides? What if you could get rid of all of those liabilities without having to pay out everything you have to the victims? As it turns out, that just might be possible. A Texas law allows companies to split into two, splitting their liabilities from their assets, and then have the liability-heavy company file for bankruptcy. Aside from the ethical concerns and allegations of fraud, this setup is perfect. The victims cannot sue the company that holds all the assets, they can only sue the company that has nothing. And that's what Johnson & Johnson is doing right now, to settle thousands of cancer lawsuits relating to their asbestos-contaminated baby powder. But how is this even possible? And if it works, why doesn't every company with any liabilities do it? Quick pause from our sponsors over at PolicyGenius. If you have a family or anybody else who depends on you, life insurance is a necessity. Mortgage payments, childcare, and other expenses don't disappear when you're gone. A good life insurance policy can give you peace of mind that even in a worst-case scenario, your loved ones will be covered. Even if you have life insurance through your employer, this may not be enough to cover your family's needs, and it won't follow you if you leave your job. But luckily, finding the right coverage for you and your family has never been easier thanks to PolicyGenius, an online marketplace designed to modernize the life insurance industry. Their technology makes it easy to compare life insurance quotes from top companies like AIG and Prudential in just a few clicks to find your lowest price. With PolicyGenius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $39 per month for $2 million of coverage. Some options offer coverage in as little as a week and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Their licensed agents work for you, not the insurance companies. There are no added fees, and your personal information is kept private. This is how they've earned 5-star reviews on both Google and Trustpilot. Your loved ones deserve a financial safety net. You deserve a smarter way to find and buy it. Head to policygenius.com/WallStreetMillennial or click the link in the description below to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you can save. And now back to the video. Everyone knows Johnson & Johnson. It's the massive American multinational with massive consumer products and pharmaceuticals businesses. As one of the top 50 largest companies in the country, it has been a member of the mighty Dow Jones for decades, and over the years has made its shareholders rich. And if you're like most American consumers, you associate them with products like Band-Aids, Neutrogena moisturizers, and perhaps even baby powder. But for some consumers, Johnson & Johnson's iconic baby powder means something very different. In 2021, the company had to set aside $4 billion to cover expenses, including a $2.1 billion settlement with 22 cancer victims who developed cancer after using Johnson & Johnson's talc-based baby powder. Investigations have shown that this baby powder had been contaminated with asbestos for years, a known carcinogen. And now that the courts have shown that they side with the victims in many of these lawsuits, Johnson & Johnson's legal troubles are piling up staggeringly high. While $2.1 billion is a large hit for any corporation, a company like Johnson & Johnson can recover from it in just a few months. But that only settles with 22 of the claimants. There are currently over 40,000 court cases over the baby powder, and each one could potentially reach a similar verdict. If each of those cases had the same outcome, that could bankrupt any company in the world operating today. Johnson & Johnson knew that if it wanted to protect its position as one of the strongest companies in the world, it had to move heaven and earth to put a cap on these cancer lawsuits. The strategy that Johnson & Johnson decided to use is known as the Texas two-step. It involves using a Texas law that allows businesses to conduct what's called a divisive merger, in which a company divides itself into two businesses and is free to distribute its assets and liabilities into the two new businesses however it wants. The first step is to conduct a divisive merger and put substantially all of the liabilities of the legacy business into one, and substantially all of the assets into the other. The second step is to have the liability-laden business file for bankruptcy, while the asset-rich business pretty much gets a free pass. This strategy has really only been used a few times, all in the last few years. In 2017, Georgia Pacific spun off a business entity that held its own asbestos litigation liabilities, and that business almost immediately filed for bankruptcy in North Carolina. Later on, a company called DBMP was spun off from another company for the same reason and filed for bankruptcy, also in North Carolina. And in 2020, the same thing happened again with a company called Train Technologies, again in the state of North Carolina. In 2021, Johnson & Johnson started by far the largest Texas two-step, by splitting into a company called New J&J and LTL Management. LTL was stuck with all the asbestos liabilities, and New J&J received almost all of the assets of the original company. Despite Johnson & Johnson being headquartered in New Jersey, LTL almost immediately filed for bankruptcy, in no other state than North Carolina. Johnson & Johnson's use of the Texas two-step has been condemned by various legal scholars and even members of Congress. Take a listen to this testimony during a 2022 Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing about a hypothetical Texas two-step process involving one company, Original Co., that then splits into two companies, Bad Co. and Good Co.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think you've made an excellent point and suggested an excellent point, which is that Good Co. Isn't a bankrupt. It's not supposed to get the protections of the bankruptcy, but it gets to enjoy those protections at the same time as, like a puppet on a string, it controls Bad Co. Because Bad Co. has overlapping officers and directors with Good Co. and the rest of the corporate family. It's really just an illusion, Your Honor, to think of Bad Co. as anything other than an empty shell, as even some of the courts applying these bankruptcies have recognized.
Makes one think of the old doctrine of piercing the corporate veil. Would that apply here?
You're exactly right, Your Honor, not Your Honor, excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
It's all right.
That, you can tell I'm a lawyer, that there are supposedly remedies that will work, but what we're talking here about time. People don't have 10 years to wait for all of this to play out. People are dying now, people need to get paid now, and ultimately this is all about delay. That's the whole point. And so justice delayed is justice denied, Mr. Chairman.
A victims group appealed the bankruptcy of LTL, and in January of 2023, the appeals court ruled that the bankruptcy was illegitimate. The judge said that the bankruptcy code's original intent was to grant safe harbor to punitive debtors in financial distress. Johnson & Johnson was not in distress. The victims group says that the bankruptcy was not filed in good faith and constitutes an improper bankruptcy purpose. It was done purely as a litigation tactic to shield Johnson & Johnson's billions of dollars of assets from the court cases. After the ruling, the company's stock dropped nearly 5% at one point in a single day, chopping billions off the company's market value in one of the worst single-day declines in years. However, there is another side to the story. There are some reasonable arguments that Johnson & Johnson can and have made for why the Texas two-step is legitimate. Firstly, they didn't saddle LTL with all the liabilities and zero assets. They set up a trust with about $2 billion for LTL to distribute to the cancer victims in the bankruptcy process. This basically means that they offered $2 billion to put an end to all future litigation. Secondly, there actually can be real benefits to the victims in the case of a bankruptcy. All of the tens of thousands of cases get resolved cleanly in one bankruptcy case, and the pool of money available to the victims theoretically gets distributed as fairly as possible to all of the claimants. If there were no bankruptcy, each individual case would have to be fought with Johnson & Johnson separately, which would take years and incur massive legal expenses. On top of that, the cases that get resolved first would likely get bigger payouts, and by the time the later cases get resolved, there may be no money left. So the claimants would likely not get fair resolutions in relation to one another. Another factor is that the claim that Johnson & Johnson's baby powder caused the cancer is still an ongoing debate. A scientific study involving over 10,000 subjects found only a slight association between the talc powder and ovarian cancer, and even that slight association has some doubt. According to the study, the use of talc powder only increased the risk of ovarian cancer by around 50% above baseline. That basically means that if you use talc powder and eventually got ovarian cancer, there's actually about a 2 in 3 chance that you would have gotten it even had you not used the talc powder. Also, the researchers say that they found no relationship between how long the talc powder was used and the risk of cancer, which is normally associated with carcinogenic things like smoking. Johnson & Johnson has used these arguments in its legal battles with the cancer victims. Without being a subject matter expert in carcinogenic substances and a lawyer, it's hard to say whether or not these penalties that Johnson & Johnson has been ordered to pay so far have been unfair. The total value of all of the pending asbestos lawsuits is of course unknown, and various analysts have come up with widely varying estimates. Some think that they could get away with settling for as little as $5 billion, while Johnson & Johnson itself has estimated the liability at about $300 billion. If they were that big, that would minimally cripple the company for many years. It may even be enough to force the entire company into bankruptcy. If that were to happen, it would seem a bit extreme, especially since the link between the talc powder and cancer seems to be debatable at best from a scientific perspective. And the disruption that it would cause in Johnson & Johnson's business would be a substantial inefficient dead loss to the company that benefits no one. Still, if their Texas two-step maneuver works, that would be massively in favor of Johnson & Johnson. By allocating $2 billion of assets to LTL, they essentially are writing their own punishment. It would be like if you got a speeding ticket and the police officer let you decide how much you want to pay for the ticket. And seeing as they've already paid out more than $2 billion in past judgments, it seems like a fair number would be significantly more than that. There needs to be a middle ground solution, one that doesn't force Johnson & Johnson itself into bankruptcy, but still fairly compensates the cancer victims for the asbestos poisoning. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Today, the experts don't seem to know what the right solution is. It's looking like the courts and the stock market are expecting Johnson & Johnson's Texas two-step gimmick to fail. And depending on how you look at it, there's some indication that Johnson & Johnson itself is preparing a contingency plan. In November of 2021, within weeks of LTL management, Johnson & Johnson announced that it would be spinning off a major part of the company. The new company would take the consumer business that makes things like Tylenol, Neutrogena, and Aveeno, while the remaining company would be the pharmaceutical business that sells drugs and medical devices like its COVID vaccine. It could be a coincidence that they're doing this at the exact same time that they're dealing with the potentially crippling lawsuits from their asbestos cancer victims. But if the Texas two-step fails, by spinning off their consumer products business, they could potentially protect half or more of their assets from the lawsuits. And unlike the Texas two-step, spinning off the consumer business is very unlikely to get blocked. Analysts have been talking about splitting up Johnson & Johnson for years, since the business that makes COVID vaccines is indeed very different from the business that makes baby powder and lotions. Operating separately could improve focus and allow each business to be more nimble, at least according to the CEO. But the reality is that they probably won't just be spinning off the consumer business, they'll also be spinning off the asbestos lawsuits. The outcome of the Johnson & Johnson situation has already had ramifications in other parts of the economy. 3M is currently facing a similar situation, with lawsuits over its Combat Arms version 2 earplugs, and they are trying a similar maneuver. After the Johnson & Johnson divisive merger was shot down by the appeals court in January, victims groups for the 3M lawsuits asked the judge to do the same thing to 3M. These lawsuits are similarly massive and involved over 100,000 claimants. Depending on the outcome of the Johnson & Johnson case, we could see a new era of corporate bankruptcies in America. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Johnson & Johnson's Texas two-step maneuver? Do you think it should be allowed to happen? Let us know in the comments section below. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.